Germany converted coal into gasoline decades before the world understood it was possible, and then the planet decided to forget it forever. Before starting, let me know in the comments where you are watching this video from, so I can find out how far it has reached. The chimneys of Luna rose against the gray sky of Saxony like cathedrals of steel and concrete. It was the winter of 1939, and inside those industrial buildings something was happening that defied the economic logic of the time. German scientists and engineers were transforming coal, that black mineral seemingly limited to heating homes and powering locomotives, into crystalline gasoline that could run cars, trucks, and airplanes. It was not magic. It was advanced chemistry. But for those observing the process for the first time, the difference was imperceptible. German synthetic fuel represented a technological feat decades ahead of its time. While the rest of the world depended almost exclusively on crude oil extracted from wells in Texas, Persia, or Venezuela, Germany had developed a complete, functional, and scalable system to manufacture its own liquid fuel from domestic resources. It was the answer to an existential problem: how to keep an industrial nation running when you do not have direct access to the black gold that powered the modern world. And yet, that technology never reached the general public. It disappeared from the global narrative almost as quickly as the smoke from those chimneys dissipated into the winter air. To understand why, we need to go back to the problem that made this innovation inevitable. Germany, in the early 20th century, was a formidable industrial power. Its factories produced precision machinery, its shipyards built imposing vessels, its engineers designed railway systems that connected entire cities. But beneath all that technical capacity lay a critical strategic vulnerability. The country practically had no oil. While Great Britain could turn to its colonies in the Middle East, and the United States pumped crude from its own territories, Germany depended entirely on imports. Every drop of gasoline that fueled its vehicles, every liter of fuel that powered its ships, had to be purchased abroad, paid for with scarce foreign currency, and transported through maritime routes that could be interrupted at any moment. This dependence was not just an economic inconvenience. It was an existential threat to any ambition of industrial self-sufficiency or independent foreign policy. A naval blockade, a diplomatic crisis, a change in international oil prices, and the entire German machinery could stop abruptly. German strategists knew this, industrialists knew this, and scientists knew this. It was in this context that the synthetic liquid fuel processes were born. The best-known process was developed by Franz Fischer and Hans Tropsch in the 1920s. These two chemists, working at the Kaiser Wilhelm Institute for Coal Research, discovered they could convert synthesis gas, a mixture of carbon monoxide and hydrogen obtained from coal, into liquid hydrocarbons using metallic catalysts at high temperatures and pressures. The Fischer-Tropsch process, as it became known, was not simple. It required sophisticated industrial facilities, precise control of reaction conditions, and deep knowledge of surface chemistry and catalysis. But it worked. And most importantly, it was scalable. At the same time, another German chemist, Friedrich Bergius, developed a different method. His process involved direct hydrogenation of coal, subjecting pulverized coal to hydrogen at extremely high pressures, in the presence of catalysts, until breaking its complex molecular structures and transforming them into simpler liquid hydrocarbons. Bergius received the Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1931 for this work. His process, although technically more demanding than Fischer-Tropsch, produced high-quality gasoline directly from coal. Both processes shared a fundamental characteristic. They converted an abundant resource in Germany, Ruhr and Silesian coal, into a product the country desperately needed and could not obtain otherwise. By the mid-30s, Germany had built synthetic fuel industrial plants in several locations. Luna, Politz, Schalven, Blechhammer. Names that now sound obscure, but at the time represented the technological frontier of energy independence. These facilities were not small. The Luna plant, operated by IG Farben, the German chemical giant, covered square kilometers and employed thousands of workers. Its reactors, distillation towers, and chemical processing systems operated 24 hours a day, transforming tons of coal into barrels of synthetic gasoline. By 1944, Germany produced approximately 4 million tons annually of synthetic fuels. This represented about 90% of its total supply of aviation gasoline and a substantial portion of its diesel. Think about it for a moment. An entire country maintained its fleet of vehicles, its airplanes, its industrial machinery, not with oil extracted from wells, but with fuel manufactured in chemical laboratories on an industrial scale. It was an extraordinary technical feat. From the chemical engineering perspective, the Germans solved problems that other countries had not even seriously attempted to address. Temperature and pressure control in massive reactors, catalyst management that had to operate continuously for months, purification of synthetic products until reaching standards usable in precision engines. Every aspect of the process represented a considerable technical challenge. And yet, it worked. The planes flew. The trucks rolled. The factories kept producing. German synthetic fuel was not theoretical. It was not a laboratory experiment published in an academic journal to impress colleagues. It was real, functional, and deployed at a national scale. So, why did the world not adopt this technology after the war? The answer has several layers. First, there is basic economics. Producing synthetic fuel was expensive. Very expensive. It required huge capital investments in complex industrial plants, consumed large amounts of energy in the synthesis process itself, and depended on continuous operations to be remotely profitable. In contrast, after 1945, oil flowed freely again in global markets. Middle Eastern oil fields were developing rapidly. Americans had abundant domestic production. The price of crude dropped to levels that made synthetic fuel economically uncompetitive. Why build a massive chemical plant that converts coal into gasoline at a high production cost, when you can simply buy cheap oil on the international market and refine it with conventional methods? Economic logic was relentless. Synthetic fuel only made sense in a context of absolute oil scarcity or extreme strategic isolation. Outside those conditions, it was simply too expensive. Second, there is the historical context. Synthetic fuel technology was inescapably associated with the regime that had driven it. The Luna and Politz plants had been strategic targets during the war. They had been repeatedly bombed because everyone knew that without synthetic fuel, German military machinery would stop. After the war, rebuilding based on that same technology would have been, at best, politically awkward. It was easier, symbolically cleaner, to forget those processes and return to energy models that did not carry that historical burden. Third, there is the geopolitical issue. The victorious powers, especially the United States and Great Britain, had vested interests in the global oil industry. American and British oil companies dominated crude extraction, refining, and distribution. Promoting a synthetic alternative that allowed other countries to reduce their dependence on imported oil did not align with those interests. There were, however, notable exceptions. South Africa, facing international sanctions during the apartheid era and without easy access to imported oil, adopted Fischer-Tropsch technology on a large scale. The state company Sasol built massive synthetic fuel plants producing gasoline and diesel from coal. To this day, South Africa maintains synthetic fuel production capacity, although its use has declined since the end of international isolation. There was also sporadic interest during the oil crises of the 70s. When oil prices soared due to OPEC embargoes, several Western countries revisited the idea of synthetic fuels. Studies were conducted. Pilot projects were proposed. Money was invested in research. But when oil prices eventually fell again, the momentum disappeared. Synthetic fuel projects were shelved, investments stopped, and the technology again became relegated to very specific niches. Today, in the 21st century, with the climate crisis shaping energy discussions, one might think synthetic fuel would receive a second look. After all, if you can manufacture liquid hydrocarbons from coal, you can also make them from carbon dioxide captured from the air and hydrogen produced with renewable electricity. In fact, that is exactly what some companies are exploring now under the name of electronic fuels or e-fuels. The basic chemistry is similar to what Fischer, Tropsch, and Bergius developed almost 100 years ago. The difference lies in the carbon and hydrogen sources and the energy context in which it is produced. But deployment remains limited. Economics remain challenging. And the technology Germany proved possible 80 years ago has still not reached widespread global adoption. Looking back, it is fascinating to consider what that industrial feat at the Luna and Politz plants represented. It was not just a technical solution to a logistical problem. It was a demonstration that energy dependence is not inevitable. That with enough investment, scientific knowledge, and industrial will, a country can make its own fuel even without access to oil. It was, in a sense, an alternative vision of the energy future. One in which countries did not compete for access to finite crude reserves buried under distant deserts, but applied advanced chemistry to transform domestic resources into usable energy. That vision did not materialize. Not because it was technically impossible, the German plants proved it was not, but because economic and political conditions never aligned to make it viable in the long term. Cheap oil won. Convenience defeated self-sufficiency. Existing infrastructure prevailed over disruptive innovation. And so, one of the most remarkable energy innovations of the 20th century was relegated to footnotes in industrial chemistry history books, known mainly to specialists, and practically invisible to the general public. Today, when we think about alternatives to fossil fuels, we think about electricity, batteries, hydrogen, solar panels, and wind turbines. Rarely do we think about the chemical synthesis of liquid hydrocarbons from non-petroleum feedstocks. And yet, that technology exists, has existed for almost a century, was tested, refined, and deployed on an industrial scale under extreme conditions. The fact that it never reached the general public is not evidence of its technical unfeasibility. It is evidence that technology adoption depends on much more than technical capability alone. It depends on economics, on politics, on historical context, on vested interests, on cultural narratives about what types of solutions are acceptable or desirable. The story of German synthetic fuel is, ultimately, a story of roads not taken. It is a reminder that the history of technology is not an inevitable march toward optimal solutions, but a contingent process shaped by human decisions, economic circumstances, and political forces. The Luna plants no longer produce synthetic gasoline. Many were dismantled after the war. Others were converted to produce different chemicals. The reactors that once transformed coal into fuel are now silent or repurposed for completely different uses. But the knowledge remains. The chemical principles have not changed. The Fischer-Tropsch and Bergius processes are still valid. The equations work the same as they did 80 years ago. What changed was not the science, but the world around it. And perhaps, in a not-too-distant future, when circumstances align again in some way, when cheap oil is no longer an option, when the need for carbon-neutral liquid fuels becomes urgent, someone will look back at those chimneys in Saxony and rediscover that the solution was already invented. That Germany already proved it was possible. That synthetic fuel is not science fiction, but documented industrial history. And that sometimes, the most advanced technologies ahead of their time are not the ones that triumph, but those that patiently wait in the archives until the world is finally ready for them. The chimneys of Luna no longer pour smoke into the sky of Saxony, but the lesson they represent remains, waiting to be rediscovered by a generation facing its own energy challenges and seeking answers in unexpected places. Because the history of technology does not end when an innovation is abandoned. It ends when it is finally forgotten completely. And German synthetic fuel, although invisible to the general public, was never completely forgotten. It is there, in academic papers, in chemical engineering manuals, in the Sasol installations in South Africa, in modern e-fuel prototypes replicating century-old chemistry with contemporary climate purposes. It is a ghost technology, real, functional, proven, but absent from public awareness. A road not taken that still exists on the map, waiting for someone to decide to walk it again.